Greetings, fellow travelers. Welcome to the 29th level of the RPG Cave. I'm one of your hosts, the level 99 human archmage, Ryan Turford. I'm joined, as always, by the level 99 elf ranger, Mr. Garret Bland. Garret, how are you doing on this lovely, lovely Sunday, except for the fact that it's like totally raining here?
Oh, it's just cloudy and dreary over here. I'm doing great. I am having my second cup of coffee.
Whoa, the coffee came back.
It came back. Yes, I didn't have time earlier. I was like, you know what? It's fitting for this episode to have that second cup. Are we ever gonna increase one level? Are we just gonna stay level 99? Is that the gist of it?
I mean, we're at max level already, Garret. So when we get to to the 100th level, like we're gonna be punching above our weight against all these monsters.
That's true. Hopefully we'll have a game update. You know, another expansion with it to increase our level cap.
Exactly.
Okay,
It'll just be like an MMO, you know, like Final Fantasy 14 Endwalker just came out this week, the week that we're recording this.
Of course.
Which, of course, increases the level cap. So that's what we're going to do. Just increase the level cap by 10 levels with the expansion pack. Of course, though, let's clear the garage a little bit, even though that's the Xbox Drive sayings, but we'll roll with the punches. So if you like what we do and you want to support the show, there's a number of ways to do that. Number one, you can subscribe to us on your podcast feed of choice. We're on Google Play, Apple Podcasts, Spotify. We're all the places to find podcasts, so check us out there. We're also on YouTube, so if you want to see our beautiful faces every single week, we put up a video version of the show every single Saturday over on YouTube, youtube.com/Yumi Capri is how you go do that. Of course, like, subscribe, share, all the things people tell you to do on YouTube. And last but not least, if you want the show a little bit early, patreon.com/Yumi Capri is how you do that. Throw a little tip and old chip tar and out gums content. All right, Garret, it is time to read from the sacred text, because have I got a topic for you this week? Let me tell you what.
Yes, you do.
This is one that I'm kind of passionate about and one that I'm very excited to talk about, because we're talking about licensed games today. Now, the reason I like to do a show like this about licensed games, and usually I tend to do that on like, whenever I'm on like a different podcast, that's one of the topics that I love to talk about. Just like soundtracks, when we did kind of the soundtrack episode is like one of our first episodes. And the reason I like to do that is because licensed games, I think, in a lot of ways, end up getting like a bad rap a lot of times. And that has to do with, you know, like really old licensed games or games that were like rushed out to be like day and date with the movie. Stuff like, you know, Thor, based off the movie Thor, launching day and date with the movie.
I did not know they had a Thor game.
It was on Xbox 360, and it might just be one of the worst Xbox 360 games. That game's up there with the Fantastic Four game and all of the other ones that, again, just came out alongside the movie. So while not all licensed games are perfect, I think there's actually more good licensed games than we normally give it credit for. So that's why I like to highlight a lot of the good ones with an episode like this. So that was kind of the idea for doing this. So first question I got to ask you, Garret, because I don't think we've ever really talked about licensed games on the show for the most part in any way. How do you feel about licensed games? Do you play licensed games at all? Like what do you think about licensed games just in general? What's your overview opinion on them?
Well, right now I don't play as much licensed games, and that's not because, gross, licensed games, I don't want to play them. It's more like there's not a game coming up that is expressing my interest that has that license or whatever. But like now in current times, licensed games are much better handled than they ever were. And I think when I get into any type of new video games, I'm more excited with licensed video games because they are not really following day and date with movies or any other kind of side media. They are actually handing it to studios that have proper care to the license itself. So right now, I feel like when I go to a video game, it doesn't matter if it's a license or not. I will give it the same type of pre expectation opinion from there. But yeah, earlier licensed games, as you said, they were coming out in droves back in the late 90s, early 2000s. I remember EA and Activision just handing them out like candy.
Yep.
I remember getting a lot of them just because my parents were like, hey, my kid likes Power Rangers and Yu-Gi-Oh! And Harry Potter and Star Wars. Let me give them this video game on all these systems.
Yeah.
And there are some gems. I do agree with that. But a lot of them were pretty underbaked, lower scale type of games. That were kind of just thrown away into the recycle bin, into the clearance sale, about not even 6 months later. They get pretty expired pretty quickly. But yeah, that's my thoughts about licensed games. Right now, I think they're much, much better than what they were before.
Absolutely. I mean, we don't like the fact that we don't see like 3 new Star Wars games every single year just shows just how much, licensed games have really changed. Cause that was the one thing growing up that I knew, like, because like LucasArts, for example, would just license out the Star Wars license to like anyone who wanted it, essentially. So like there would be like 3 or 4 like Star Wars games a year. Like I remember in the PlayStation 1 era, there was one year I think where we got like 5 different Star Wars games on that platform, because we got Jedi Power Battles, which was this like hack and slash game. We got Star Wars Demolition, which was almost like Twisted Metal, but with like Star Wars vehicles.
Oh my goodness.
Star Wars Masters of Terrascasi, which is like the Star Wars fighting game that's like infamously bad, as well as 2 other ones that I'm kind of blanking on. But like, oh my God, like there used to be so many. And again, Star Wars wasn't the only license that was like that. Stuff like Marvel, DC, like you'd see a ton of like Batman games or like really terrible Superman games and stuff like that. So I kind of fell into that camp too, where I got a lot of them as gifts, especially growing up, especially on NES or Super Nintendo. And especially those 2 platforms were like really like heavy on licensed games. Like there was just a ton of them every year, to the point where you'd get like games that shouldn't have ever really existed. Stuff like Wayne's World, for example. Like, who needs a video game based off Wayne's World?
Really?
Let alone
Wayne's World.
Yeah, that's a game on Super Nintendo and NES, and let me tell you what, that game's interesting. But even you've got stuff like the Adventures of Rocky and Bullwinkle, or a whole bunch of stuff that again it just doesn't make any sense, including the infamous Michael Jordan Chaos in the Windy City, a side-scrolling beat 'em up game starring Michael Jordan in Chicago, beating up guys. Oh man, so good. That game, of course, written and directed by Amy Hennig, who created Uncharted. So there you go. Fun facts.
Okay.
But yeah, so that's why I love talking about licensed games. For me, I do play licensed games a lot. Like if it's a license I care about and the game looks good, I'm probably going to check it out, especially too with stuff like anime games, which I'm sure we'll be talking about on this list, because a lot of RPGs that we already like kind of have anime aesthetics. So
they do.
It just stands to reason that most animes with a really good story are probably primed for a good video game if you handle it correctly. So we'll definitely be talking about that. But obviously, I also want to define kind of what our terms are for what makes a game a licensed game, which is essentially any game that's based off a property outside of video games that already exists.
Yes.
So it could be a book, it could be a movie, it can be a TV show, it could be anything itself. It could be a sports team, again, like Shaq Fu or Michael Jordan, the Chaos in the Windy City. It could be based off anything, as long as that thing doesn't originate in the realm of video games. So like even though you might have spin-offs that feel like licensed games, like the Sonic and the Dark Brotherhood or Mario RPG, those are more just spin-offs and less licensed games.
Right.
Even though it's like licensed, like it's a different studio outside of let's say Nintendo, for example, like with Square Enix working on Mario RPG. It's not really a licensed game, even though they're licensing the Mario IP, if that makes any sense.
Right.
But so what do we think makes a good licensed game? I've actually have kind of a definition that I've been saying for years, Garrett, but I kind of want to know your take first, especially because I've been talking a lot. What to you makes like a really good licensed game?
Well, I think of there's great examples nowadays with good licensed game. It's like they treat the license with care. Like you're not going to get wrong information. You're not going to skip a lot of different amounts of content or whatever. The world needs to be there in that video game, and it needs to be realized kind of similarly to other types of media, like a book or a movie or whatever. I think, upon what makes a good video game is a good video game. We discussed what a great RPG is.
Yeah.
I think it's just that connection now with the licensed game. You don't want to try to make it like copy on copy with a movie per se. I mean, that could be fine, but more often than not, we've just seen some really underbaked games when you do that. So you got to make a video game, and then you just implement that world, those elements from that license into the game, and see if it fits. And if it fits, that's great. You made a good licensed video game, I think.
Yeah, and I to your point, like My definition is actually pretty similar, but it actually is even more simplistic, which is do you feel like one of the characters, or do you feel like you're part of that world in that license?
Okay.
And number two, does it feel fun to play? And as long as it meets those tenets, I think it's a good license game, because again, but it has to hit both. It can't, have like really good gameplay, but then not feel like the license, because then I feel like it kind of like fails on being, a game that's in that license. And likewise, if it goes too far in the other direction, where it feels like the world of that license, but the gameplay is bad, like then you're Fantastic Four, Rise of the Silver Surfer, or a game like that, which is not really, a good situation to be in. And again, an example of what I consider as a really good license game is a game like Friday the 13th, the game, which we actually got pretty recently. It was all buggy at launch, but once most of the bugs were fixed, I think it was a really solid asymmetrical multiplayer game where you have 6 camp counselors and then one person playing as Jason, and he's basically hunting them down. And again, you could tell that they really understood the license well because of the way that they wrote the game, the dialogue, as well as, all of the different versions of Jason you could play, and all the way that they all kind of played a little bit differently, combined with all the camp counselors and whatnot, kind of feeling like they were straight ripped from the movies, but also it just being like a really fun horror game as well, that it kind of inspired games like Dead by Daylight, or we've seen a whole bunch of games now like this, like that Dragon Ball Z The Breakers game that they announced pretty recently, where it's like a survival horror Dragon Ball Z game. So
that's very interesting to see.
A lot of that really stemmed from that. So that's an example of what I think is like a really good licensed game. Even though it did have its problems, I think it had great gameplay and it understood its license really well. So
yes, yeah. I think I have like 2 kind of examples of like what's a good licensed game and what's not so good licensed game. The Lego games, actually, more often than not, they do a really good job of implementing the license themselves into that Lego universe. And, they follow the content more or less, but in a comedic way. And they put a lot of different extras and features. It's a collectathon, basically, in these games. And they're just so much fun. You just like lay down on the couch. You can like be with another person in couch co-op or whatever, and you could just have a good time going through that world, through that universe. I think they, time and time again, they have a good formula for the Lego games. So those are good licensed games, I think. The not so good licensed game is Star Wars Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith.
Whoa, you're hurting my heart, dear Garret. I actually have a soft spot for that game.
I have a little bit of a soft spot, but there's clear examples of that formula. It's like, really, you're going to do that? And it's the implementation of movie clips into the games. I'm glad they don't do that anymore. Yeah. That was just the absolute worst.
That was an early 2000s thing, because like I've talked about it on the Crossroads, our original Xbox show on the Xbox Drive, and one of my favorite games on that list was Lord of the Rings: The Return of the King. And one of the things that game did was like it was full of like clips from the movie that then blended into the gameplay kind of cinematics, and like it was like it looked amazing at the time that it came out, but like as you play it now, it looks awful. It's like one of the worst effects in games. But that game is like really fun, so I encourage people to actually check that one out. But yeah. But to your point about, them using movie clips and all the games, especially too back in those days as well, where again, it wasn't even like, it was DVD quality video, but like the gameplay itself never matched that quality. So it just felt like weird and mismatched. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So there you go. So now that we've given kind of examples and whatnot, I feel like it's time to kind of talk about some of our favorite RPGs. And again, I think we've got like a pretty good list, even though again, we haven't looked at each other's, kind of references ahead of time. But I think like the RPG genre actually makes like a really good genre for a lot of licenses, especially because like one of the failings of a lot of like traditional, more action-based license games are that they make you feel less like the character because you either feel like too powerful or too weak. Like Superman's a perfect example of this, where like they keep trying to do like 3D action Superman games, but he's so powerful that in a way you can't balance the difficulty properly enough to make that work. Like that's why I think like Superman as a character works so much better than in a game like Injustice, which is a fighting game, where there's like this canonical reason as to why he's as powerful as the other characters, or even in like a turn-based RPG, I think like would be really cool for something like Superman. as an example. So let's jump into this. And also we asked for some community suggestions as well. And I'm going to kind of pepper them through as we kind of go through and talk about some of our favorites. So Garret, I'm going to start things off because there's a no-brainer game that I would mention here, especially because when we were asked for questions this week, I put a GIF from this game, and that is Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic 1 and 2.
Yes.
Both BioWare's original and then Obsidian's sequel. I think both of these are incredible turn-based RPGs on the original Xbox. Some of the best Star Wars games ever, both as far as just writing is concerned, because I think the writing and the storytelling in that game is just on another level compared to a lot of other games that are out there. But then the combat at the time was a lot of fun, but it definitely has aged kind of poorly. And it's definitely not as fun to go back to today. It almost feels like playing like an MMO from the early 2000s when you play that game. So
I exactly know what you mean. Yes.
Yeah. So it's definitely harder to go back to, but I think the stories are so good that I think they're worth just playing just for that. And then when you can kind of combine that with BioWare, Dallas's The Old Republic, which is kind of the Knights of the Old Republic MMO, I think you've got a pretty solid series as far as that it's like rich with great storytelling and great gameplay and awesome characters. So yeah, I definitely had to at least put those here and talk about them at least a little bit, even though, again, I feel like the gameplay has aged pretty poorly. I'm actually really excited that they're doing a remake of them as well.
Me too.
But what do you think about Knights of the Old Republic, Garret? What's your opinion?
Oh, I never really focused on them, but like when I saw Sean Capri playing one of them this year, and he was like, oh, it's a little bit aged, a little bit old. I'm like, you know what? I think it's good to wait and see how this remake comes about. It is made by a completely different studio, Aspyr, and of course they've been making a lot of the Star Wars ports to current gen stuff. So we'll see how the remake is going to go. We don't know what they're going to do to it. Are they going to really stay true to the Knights of the Old Republic? Are they just going to Final Fantasy VII remake it where they completely change the game mechanics or the RPG elements of it? We'll see. I'm cautiously optimistic because Aspyr is it's a long running studio, but they really haven't made I guess like their own game.
This is actually their very first game that they made by themselves.
Yes.
So
right. It's gonna be interesting. So Knights of the Old Republic, as you said, very high praise RPGs at the time. It was such a gem apart from the other licensed games that were going on. So I'm glad that they're backwards compatible on Xbox. They're easily accessible on PC as well. I think I got both of them for like $2 each on Steam or something like that. So if you guys are interested in a good Star Wars RPG, a little bit dated, but still really, really good on the story side, I mean, they're out there pretty cheap. Yeah,
and I will say too, even if you want like the physical copies of them, they're pretty cheap as well. Like it's accessible on all fronts, I think, for this one. So I definitely think they're worth checking out. And also, it's really like when you look at the history of Star Wars in the world of video games and looking at like their games over the years, the only other things that we've gotten close to RPGs from Star Wars are the Yoda Story games on the original Game Boy, and those were not good games. Those were really terrible games. So it's like, beyond that, we really haven't had like Star Wars RPGs, which is a series that I think works so well in RPGs that it hurts. It hurts me to say that really KOTOR's our only suggestion for this list. Well, I'm going to bring in a member of the community before I go to you, Garret, with your first pick. And this comes to us from Mike at BlazeKnight0923, who says, the only licensed RPG that comes to mind for me is the Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic games, which were good at the time. They don't hold up well nowadays. Luckily, the remake is on the way. And I mean, Mike is kind of just echoing kind of some of our same sentiments, but I had to bring this in as well because I think that,
of course,
it's the one that I knew we would probably get comments about as well. And they're definitely some of the best out there, at least as far as the story is concerned, for sure. But Garret, I'm going to go to you because I think there's another one that's kind of a no-duh one that I know is probably going to come from you. So tell me, just get it over.
And someone else pointed it out like really blankly. I was like, oh yeah, of course, these games. And that is, well, I only played one of them, and that is South Park Stick of Truth. I did not play Fractured But Whole yet. I actually got it a long time ago, and I'm meaning to get to it, but I never got to it. I heard it's great. These are fantastic set of RPGs made by Obsidian. Are both of them made by Obsidian? I know the first one is. The second one, I think it is, but it's published by Ubisoft or something like that.
No, they're both published by Ubisoft, but I actually don't think it's
Okay.
Obsidian that did the second one.
Oh, okay, cool. I'm glad I have clarification on that. But yeah, South Park Stick of Truth is an amazing licensed RPG. And if anyone who doesn't know South Park, it's very comedic, very hilarious, kind of a grungy type of comedy, dark comedy behind it. And it's been, years and years of TV shows, and I'm glad that and another great strategy that they've done with these games is that the creators of South Park actually were very heavily involved with these South Park games. Literally putting like any kind of reference from an episode, they put it into this game.
Yeah.
And not only that, they made great turn-based RPGs. It has this kind of like quick action button combat where if you're all of a sudden you need to attack, you need to press a button to defend yourself. And then if you want to, there's like kind of a prompt for spells or attacks to do a major critical attack or whatever. And then there was like strengths and weaknesses between both of them, enemies and your allies themselves, multiple party members, classes, the whole gambit of a turn-based RPG. And I thought it was great. And I laughed all the way through this game. But what about you? What do you like about South Park?
Oh man, those games are amazing. Now, when I say those games, I definitely am more talking about Stick of Truth because I think that's already one of the best RPGs on the 360 era, in my opinion.
Yes.
In a lot of ways. So I think that that game in particular is incredible. And for all the reasons you talked about it, where it was the combat mechanics, the writing, the humor, the fact that you actually got to see South Park mapped for the very first time, which is actually something like Trey Stone and Matt Parker actually had said while they were developing the game is they had never mapped out where all the things were in South Park before. So they actually had to come up with a map of what South Park actually looks like for the game itself, which is actually like, again, now like the canon version of what that looks like. But then also there's like some stuff that happens later in the game that just really warmed my heart, especially for someone who lives in Canada. Like there's a whole section later in the game that's amazing. And just the combat itself, to your point, it really reminded me of playing something like Super Mario RPG or like the Mario and Luigi games. Like they had like that action style to them while being turn-based. So you didn't just have the monotony of, taking turns over and over again. Plus there were some really creative and interesting boss fights as well in that game. And I just had a ton of fun with it. And to go back to Fractured But Whole at least a little bit, I actually looked it up because I didn't want angry comments about this. This is actually developed by Ubisoft San Francisco on that game. So it was not actually the Obsidian. It was actually the team that does Rocksmith, of all people, doing that game.
Interesting.
If that makes any sense. But that game's actually like a tactical RPG. So it's more like a miniaturized version of Fire Emblem, where essentially you've got like a grid-like system, but it's not like an overhead grid system. It's still on the same kind of, 2D plane, like isometric plane that from the Stick of Truth. But you can only get, it's like, maybe you've got like 10 tiles for the entire battlefield. So you have to position your troops correctly. If enemies attack you in the back, for example, they deal more damage. So it's a lot more complex of a battle system, which is why I think it failed at least a little bit, because I think the writing was still there with that game, but I think just the combat, I think, became overly complicated in a way that I would have, normally been okay with, but with a game like that within the South Park engine, when they already had a great fighting system from the first one, it did sour my experience at least a little bit. But I still think it's worth playing. If you like tactical games and you like the South Park writing, then yeah, I think you'll probably still like it a lot. It just isn't as good as the first game. But they're definitely both very, very, very solid choices as far as RPGs. And I'm going to bring in Todd Oxtra at Toxtra.
Yes.
Who says, I love the South Park RPGs. I love the mechanics, story, and the fact that they don't overstay their welcome. And yeah, that's one thing we didn't mention as well, is they're like super quick to play through. Yeah, you don't have to worry about them being super long or anything like that. Like Stick of Truth, you can beat in a weekend and have a great time with it. So there you go. It just feels like almost like playing like a season of the TV show in a lot of ways. Fractured But Whole is actually a lot longer, but it still respects your time in a lot of ways. So Next on the list is, and we're gonna go all the way back to the original Xbox era once again. And Garrett, I don't think you've actually probably played these games, but I want to bring them up anyways because they're Marvel licensed games. X-Men Legends 1 and 2, as well as Marvel Ultimate Alliance. They kind of fit in like one specific series where they all kind of entwine together, but they're essentially like dungeon crawling Diablo style games, but with Marvel characters. Yeah. So the two X-Men Legends games came out on the PS2, original Xbox, and GameCube, and they basically allowed you to unlock a bunch of different characters across the X-Men universe. But for the sequel, what they did is they allowed you to also play as the villains. So you actually got to build like a team of like. You could build like all the bad guys like Magneto and Mystique and Toad and all the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, or you could like mix and match them with the X-Men and whatnot, and you were basically out there to stop Apocalypse. And those games were actually really, really, really fun back in the day. And I think the combat from those games still holds up super well. I still think that if you like games like Diablo, I think you're gonna dig these if you've never checked them out. Even something like Marvel Ultimate Alliance was developed by Activision and came out a little bit later. Those came out on the Xbox 360 because there were actually two of those games, and then we eventually got a third one on Switch as well, which came out a couple of years ago. Which that game was not very good, but they went with a different developer on that one. They went with Team Ninja, and their games are always kind of hit or miss. But I can definitely say the X-Men Legends games and Marvel Ultimate Alliance just are really fantastic dungeon going games. And Marvel Ultimate Alliance is essentially just like X-Men Legends, but with all the Marvel characters. So like you start your party, for example, with like Wolverine, Iron Man, Captain America, and Spider-Man. Like how cool is it to, run around in an RPG playing as those characters, right? So plus we don't really get too many Marvel RPGs. So I think that these ones are, all these games in this series are really standout RPGs from Marvel. And honestly, even though this last one with Team Ninja didn't work out, I would love to see them revisit the idea, but with, a studio that's known for this type of thing, especially because Team Ninja isn't really known for doing, top-down action RPGs, and I just don't think they did a very good job with it. And I would love to see them, like, take another kick at the can with this idea. Even if they kind of separate it from that series name, like, I would love to see them do, like, more RPGs in the Marvel universe. But I'm guessing, Garrett, you haven't checked out any of these games, right?
I haven't, but it reminds me of the free Capcom and Marvel free-to-play games that came out on the PS4, I think. And I played the Capcom one for a good while, but I remember that being over the top, and you just like build your own type of your own character, and like essentially making like a character build. It was an MMO action RPG.
Yeah, I think it was called Marvel Heroes.
Marvel Heroes, that's it. And then I played the Capcom one. I just forgot the name of it.
Right.
But yeah, I hope that they would make this type of game again. I really hope. Well, the Marvel Ultimate Alliance, was it 3? The one that came out on Switch. I was very interested in that because it seemed like a cool beat 'em up game, but it keeps being $60 and then $47. I'm just like, no, I'm not gonna pay that much for it. Looked pretty cheap to me. It didn't look that well. So hopefully we get a new one, a good entry or a good production value at least to make me get that higher price tag or make me pay a little bit more. I would be totally into it. I love Diablo type of games.
Yeah, because I actually think like it's an idea that totally works. You're right. Like putting more production value into it, I think would go a long way. Because just like they did with the original games, because all three of those games with the two X-Men Legends games and Marvel Ultimate Alliance, I think the budget was there and those were, really solid games when they came out. It's just with the second one, because they did a second one based around Civil War that was on Xbox 360. You could definitely tell it was definitely going in the cheaper direction. And it was kind of a throwaway game in a lot of ways, but the rest of them really solid RPGs. Also, they go really deep with some of the customization of your characters. You can customize all their different abilities, and each of the character has like a big skill tree associated with it. So like, there's a lot to do with those games. So definitely check them out, especially if you've got like a PS2 handy or something like that. But Garrett, what's another one on your list? And I know there's probably another like kind of no-brainer one too. Might be based on this book people may have heard of as well.
Well, that one's a no-brainer. So, I mean, I could just say it, Witcher 3.
You can do that too, because we did do a whole episode on it. But I wanted to bring it up here because it is technically a licensed game.
Witcher 3 and is technically a licensed game. Play it. Listen to our old episode about it. I won't speak more upon it. But the next game or sets of games I want to talk about, and I think they do a pretty good job, more or less, and that's the Yu-Gi-Oh games. I'm really into Yu-Gi-Oh, or I was when I was a kid. I love the card-based strategy games. I wish I was more into Magic. I wasn't hanging with the right crowd with Magic to get into Magic.
I was gonna say you weren't hanging out with me playing, Commander or one of these other Magic formats.
Yeah, that's true. But Yu-Gi-Oh has been a staple in my strategy card game, like kind of franchised. I collected a lot of Yu-Gi-Oh cards. I watched the shows, at least for the first two big seasons, the one with Yugi and then the GX one. So I have like the two games that I played as a kid and wholeheartedly recommend if you can get them. They're pretty good. The first one is Yu-Gi-Oh! Nightmare Troubadour. This one came out on the DS in 2005. It was I think an earlier DS title. And this one was the first Yu-Gi-Oh game that had 3D animations behind their monsters, which was really cool. It was pretty pixelated, but you still had them. It went through the same campaign as the original season. So they go through chapter by chapter, and you kind of go. There's not like a 3D animation. You go or walk around. It's basically like a map on your bottom screen, and you kind of click where, okay, what's the next kind of enemy or opponent you're going to choose. There's like a little radar type of thing, and then you kind of face them. And then they'll pop up in your top screen, all 2D character art. If you guys know Yu-Gi-Oh, Yu-Gi-Oh is great. Like the card-based game itself, it's the same thing. And I'm really glad that they have these video games because they kind of teach you the rules. More or less. I think the one fault of Yu-Gi-Oh games is that they always keep telling you, oh, you have a trap card. Do you want to activate it? Do you want to not activate it?
Because it's like, kind of like it has to. You can play it at like instant speed, so it just wants to make sure like to give you that option. Because I mean, as someone who plays a lot of digital card games like Magic: The Gathering Arena, for example, like I know that from that where it's like it tells you like every turn, like cycle of the turn, like do you want to use this instant spell in your hand, and so on and so forth. So
right. So Nightmare Troubadour, and I'm glad that you had their own cards to collect in the game because you don't have to spend money to get real cards. You just have the game, and then you can go through and open the card packs and you go through that same cycle, but you get in-game currency and you kind of just progress from there. I've made a lot of different decks because of it, and really, more or less, I had better experience with the Yu-Gi-Oh video games than actual Yu-Gi-Oh card-based games because you really had to go out there and get the packs. And Yu-Gi-Oh I think it's a little worse than Magic just because it's not really customizable. There's one certain set or like one certain deck you need, and you need those cards. Whereas Magic, it's like, oh, you can mix all these colors together and you can make something out of nothing. Given like enough cards. Nightmare Troubadour, and then Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Monsters GX. That was the GBA game, which is weird. It came out 6 months after Nightmare Troubadour. I don't know why they made a GBA. I guess they were in the middle of a GBA game. I was going to say, they were still making GBA games until like 2006, 2007, I think. Yeah. So it's kind of weird to see a GBA Yu-Gi-Oh game after a DS Yu-Gi-Oh game, but they were completely different seasons. One was the GX monsters, and I like those two as well. What I recommend today now, Yu-Gi-Oh! Legacy of the Duelist, Link Evolution. You see on sale a lot. It goes through all the different seasons. So if you want to just play the first set of Yu-Gi-Oh! cards, you can, and just go from there. But you can go all the way up to the current ones with updated cards, and they have colors of cards all over the rainbow now. They got whites, they got blacks. I don't know what they're doing anymore with Yu-Gi-Oh! But I'm glad I have it on Switch, so and still play it from time to time. What about you?
Yeah,
do you like Yu-Gi-Oh?
I was gonna say I actually like Yu-Gi-Oh! A lot. It's one of the It's one of those things, though, where it was a generational thing where when the Yu-Gi-Oh TV show came out and was first airing on like WB Kids, I was a little too old for when it came out, or at least I feel I was, because especially if you watch like the 4Kids version where it's just like it's totally, completely censored, and the way they did the writing, they wanted to make it more like a kids show. So I thought, Yu-Gi-Oh is stupid because, I'm a teenager and I'm more into, D&D or StarCraft or Match of the Gathering, because those are more mature in quotations. But
Got it.
But actually, I got into Yu-Gi-Oh much later than that, because I ended up picking up the physical card game after playing some of the GBA games. Like to your point, where I was playing some of the games that were based around kind of the Battle City arc from the original Yu-Gi-Oh series, and they were just standard card games that weren't really RPGs or anything like that, but you were collecting cards for your deck and you were opening the packs that you were kind of talking about. And they're more just streamlined versions of the card game itself. So I haven't really checked out any of the Yu-Gi-Oh RPGs that you kind of described. I kind of want to now because their Troubadour actually sounds like a cool game that I kind of want to check out. So I would love to know more, but Yu-Gi-Oh itself, I like the card game. The only thing I don't really like about it is like, it's almost like some of the newer cards are almost like word soup in a lot of ways, where
it's getting
there's
bad.
Like so much text on the cards. And plus, one of the things I don't really like about the Yu-Gi-Oh format when it comes to cards is just there's only really one format, and it takes all the cards that have ever existed in Yu-Gi-Oh, and it kind of creates the problem that you described, Garrett, where you only have like one deck or two decks that really work. So you don't really have a lot of flexibility outside of that. Otherwise, you're not doing the best thing. So there you go. So as for me, I'm going to stick with the world of anime, Garrett, because we got to talk about some of these anime fighting role-playing games. And the first one I'm going to start with is actually also on the DS, and I think it's actually a bit of a hidden gem in a lot of ways. I think this is actually a really solid game that most people don't even know even exists. And this one is Bleach, the Third Phantom, based off the Bleach series of anime, which is about a character named Ichigo who becomes a soul weaver, and he's basically killing these creatures called hollows, which are these evil spirits essentially. So what was cool about this game, it was essentially a Bleach Fire Emblem clone in a lot of ways. Like it's a strategy RPG that plays like Fire Emblem, and you've got all of the main like soul reapers from the show as kind of your characters, and you're killing hollows in like strategic ways. And I think that the combat itself is really well done. And it does license really well because it gives you a lot of story around the Soul Society itself, and kind of gives you more backstory on a lot of the characters from the show. And I think it does a really good job of being a great strategy RPG. So it's one that I know a lot of people probably didn't even know it came out, or probably would overlook, because at the time there were 3 different Bleach games on the 3DS and or just on the original DS, and they were kind of hit or miss. There's 2 of them that are really good. There's this one, and then Bleach Dual Souls or Dark Souls. It's something like that. I can't remember the exact name off the top of my head, but those 2 games are really good. But Bleach the Third Phantom, if you like strategy RPGs and you like Bleach, like this is a no-brainer. Like this game is awesome. So I had to throw it in here as well as another game that goes in there. But I think there's lots of great anime suggestions I could really give, because I think, like as I talked about before, a lot of RPGs, like JRPGs in particular, are kind of like anime based in a lot of ways, so it makes sense why anime would work. Another one that maybe I don't know if you were going to bring up, Garrett, was Fairy Tail, which was actually done by Gust.
Oh yeah, I've heard
the makers of the Atelier series. Like they made like a really great turn-based RPG based off the Fairy Tail anime. Like I think that's another one that's really solid, and it's on PS4 only, but I think it's definitely worth checking out. Or I think it may be on PC as well. I can't remember, but I think that one's really, really, really solid, and it kind of made me want to go back and eventually try the Atelier games, which we talked about on the Atelier episode. Because I was like, oh, gosh, what other games do they make? Because this game was really fun. And I was like, oh, they make the Atelier games, and I know nothing about them. So I'll ask Garrett about this. But so I think those are 2 really great anime choices. I've got a bunch on this list. But before I get to them, Garrett, let's go back to you. What's your next suggestion?
So I played Harry Potter in the Chamber of Secrets for Game Boy Color, which was essentially Final Fantasy mechanics into a Harry Potter game. So it's turn-based combat. You go into these battles with all walks of life of magical creatures. And of course, Harry Potter's the main character. And then you had your battle mates, which is Hermione and Ron. And they all had different types of abilities and level up system, buffs and debuffs and so on and so forth. So it was actually an enjoyable experience with specifically the Chamber of Secrets. I know they made the first one and the third one as well. Which was actually pretty surprising. They were delightful little games of licensed RPGs that I don't think a lot of people quite know. And again, they're based off of the books. So I think there was a lot more lore going into these games, actually more than the movies themselves, which was quite interesting. So what do you think about that?
That sounds really awesome. Like, I mean, don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
I'm not going to pretend I'm a huge Harry Potter fan, because I'm not.
Yeah.
I've never really been into Harry Potter thing. And it goes to something I talked about with, the Yu-Gi-Oh example, where I think it was just a generational thing where, I was more into stuff like Lord of the Rings at the time, because it was almost like the more mature, like fantasy-like experience. So, and then when I went back and, checked out Harry Potter later, I've just never really been into it at the same time. So I've never gone to the series, but you know what? Like those sound like fun games. So I might have to find them somewhere and check them out, because I didn't know that, because I knew Harry Potter games had come out on Game Boy, but I didn't know they were RPGs. So
yeah, I think the first three are for the handheld Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance versions, but I don't know about the others. I don't know the other reviews. I am very, very excited for the Harry Potter, the new Harry Potter game
Hogwarts Legacy.
That was announced. Hogwarts Legacy. I am totally into that. I saw that leaked trailer, and I'm just like, oh my goodness, let me be lost in that world. Let me learn all the spells and potions, and give me a class and or a house. Yeah. And maybe that house will have different skills and abilities. Oh my goodness, Ryan, I would be in heaven.
I mean, that's a game we'll probably maybe even talk about on a list like this maybe next year. Who knows? Because it's supposed to come out in 2022. So, I mean, barring it doesn't get delayed again, but we'll see. Yeah. But that's pretty cool. I'm glad that you brought that in there. So kind of to round out the conversation, I do have some more on my list as well that I kind of want to, run through real quick. I mean, I'm amazed that neither of us actually brought this up before, but I mean, I think that's just testament to us not being fans of Kingdom Hearts. But Kingdom Hearts is a licensed RPG franchise that I think people really love. So I would be remiss if we didn't mention Kingdom Hearts here, even though I guess I know you and I are not the biggest Kingdom Hearts fans, although I did really like Kingdom Hearts 1 and 2. But everything else outside of Kingdom Hearts 1 and 2, it's just like, I haven't really been excited to play or anything like that. But I think that they really use the Disney license well in a lot of ways.
Yes, they do.
Like, even though I'm not someone who was like super into Disney, I loved exploring those Disney worlds that you got to go to, like going to the Christmas Land and the Hercules Town and whatnot. Like, I loved doing all that stuff. So I do like the idea behind Kingdom Hearts. I just don't really love the Mora aspect of
There's just so much baggage with Kingdom Hearts games, man. Like, I really tried. I really tried to get into the first one. That when it came over to the PS4 and the up-res HD ports, and it's like halfway through, I'm like, no, I'm not having fun at all with this game. I think it's just a product of its time too. I'm sure it was great on the PS2. But nowadays, it's like, if you try to get a new fan into Kingdom Hearts, unless they're really into Disney, I don't think you'll get someone like me into that type of game.
For sure.
So.
And then another long-running series that we didn't mention either, that again, I know comments will be there if we don't mention, is the Baldur's Gate series, which is actually from BioWare, because those are based off Dungeons and Dragons. And they were essentially like playing Dungeons and Dragons, but in video game form, without the pen and paper, essentially. So I thought those games were really good as well. And then, a couple other anime games I wanted to include here. Dragon Ball Z Attack of the Saiyans. We talked about that on our Monolith Soft episode. Yeah. I think that game's really good. Full Metal Alchemist 2, The Curse of the Crimson Elixir, which is on...
There's a Full Metal Alchemist game.
There's two of them. There's two of them. They're from Square Enix. They're on PlayStation 2. And then they never made anyone of them again. The first one, Full Metal Alchemist and The Broken Angel, isn't as good, but the Curse of the Crimson Elixir is like a really good game. So I wanted to make sure that I include that here. Fate Extra, which is based off the Fate franchise on the PSP, a really good RPG on PlayStation Portable. Lord of the Rings, The Third Age, which was essentially like a spin-off of the Lord of the Rings series, where essentially it was more about like what was going on in the rest of Middle Earth while the Lord of the Rings was happening. But it was like a really good like turn-based RPG on the Xbox 360 era. And then last but not least, Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines. This is of course based off the pen and paper RPG as well, just similar to Dungeons and Dragons on PC as well. I know people really love that, and a sequel's coming as well pretty soon. Because we got that announced during one of the Xbox showcases. So I'm excited to check that one out as well. So that rounds out our list. But before we kind of move on to kind of our favorite, like our next thing that we want to talk about, I want to bring in Todd Oxtra at Toxtra, who had one last suggestion for us. And this suggestion actually came on a previous episode of the show. But Todd wanted to let us know kind of what his favorite games were. And that is Betrayal at Krondor is a PC game based off a series of books. I love the game so much that I started reading the books. The books became my favorite series of all time. And I remember, I think it was the Witcher episode where Todd had told us about this. Like he had mentioned before, like, did we play this? And I mean, I still don't think either of us have really played these games since then. I know they're on PC, but it's just one of those things where I think it's harder to go back to a lot of CRPGs for me personally, but I'm glad you really enjoyed them, Todd. It sounds like it's a really cool, like our book series, kind of similar to The Witcher, but then in video game form. So I want to give that a shout out here as well.
That genre in general, man, CRPGs and essentially those types of games from like the 90s, early 90s and onward. I'm just like, they didn't really age that well to like for the like the current audience for video games now. So it's cool that you like it, and I'm glad people do. It's just I don't know how many people are gonna like it now.
For sure. So I have two last questions I got to ask before we kind of finish the show today. Number one, Garret, do you have a favorite licensed game outside of the RPG genre?
There is a couple of them out there. I really enjoyed one of my childhood favorites, Spider-Man 2. The original one.
In that game.
Yeah, you do deliver pizzas in that game. I remember that. I played that on the GameCube probably like at least 3 or 4 times when I was a kid. And that one felt really nice to sling around and go everywhere. I remember playing Spider-Man 3 on Xbox 360, and it didn't grab me as much as Spider-Man 2. That game was real bad. So that's one game. Another game that actually came out during the PS4 Xbox One era, but I don't think many people brought it out enough, and that's Mad Max.
Ooh, that's a good one.
I played that on the PS4, and it's a very solid. It's kind of it's an action kind of Ubisoft template game. But what I really like about it is like you got Batman mechanics, but with the combat and with a little bit of guns here and there, but the vehicle combat and the customization in there was really cool. It was really expansive, and you had a bunch of different styles, and you can have different modifications to your vehicle to face off different enemies. Even though it wasn't great on the story front, I really enjoyed my time with Mad Max in that world itself. I think they did a good job with that one.
Those were they did a really good job with that. Like they made the Just Cause games as well, and then they did Rage 2 as well. So they make good games.
Yes.
Nice.
That's pretty much it off the top of my head.
Nice. As for me, I got to shout out a few games. Number one, Batman Arkham Asylum. One of the best, 3D Metroidvania games that's out there.
Yes.
I really enjoyed that game quite a lot. Marvel Spider-Man on PlayStation 4. I really love that game. I actually like the PlayStation 2 and original Xbox Spider-Man games, like Spider-Man 2 and Ultimate Spider-Man. I think were both really good games, but I feel like Marvel Spider-Man kind of ruined those games for me in a lot of ways, where it just felt so much better to control Spider-Man in that game, and I love the story in that game as well. It's so well acted, and especially Miles Morales too. On top of that, with his own campaign, I thought both of those were really well done. So I can't
really
wait for Spider-Man 2, the new Spider-Man 2, not the old Spider-Man 2, the new Spider-Man 2. I can't wait for that one. I think those are probably my 2 favorite licensed games outside of RPGs. Otherwise, my favorite one is probably still Knights of the Old Republic, but that's an RPG. So there we go. And then last question I want to ask you, Garret, before we close out. Is there a license out there that you think would make a really good RPG? What do you think?
Yes, and well, they try to make licensed games, and they fell to the bottom of my list, like just way bottom. I hate these games. The license is Avatar: The Last Airbender.
Okay.
That is by far my favorite show of all time. I probably can watch it time and time and again, and I will like instantly love it again. They can make a very good, if you had unlimited funds in the right studio, you can make a very good MMO action RPG out of it. Because it has all the fixings in there. You can have like classifications of different benders, right? You got earth, fire, water, and air. And then you got all the different tribes and different clans and stuff like that. You could be a firebender, but you could be like a good firebender, so you don't have to be in the Fire Nation army if you want to. Or you can be one of the air nomadic tribes. There's 4 of them. We got 2 water pole. Like there's so many places where you can start with the Avatar game, and like that license. Apparently, it was botched in the video game realm with I think it was Platinum Games made 2 of them, and they were just not good at all. Easiest 1,000 gamer score, but you wouldn't. They're not fun games at all. So yeah, I would highly recommend Avatar: The Last Airbender being a great startup for an MMO action RPG, but I know that's never going to happen. Yeah, unfortunately,
that would be amazing. Like that, the world is just so rich with storytelling that it would be like really interesting to be able to explore that on your own, and then make your own bender as well. So yeah, I love that idea, Garret. I think that's actually a really smart idea. As for me, I actually told this, I think, on the Assemble XP podcast, because I was a guest on their show pretty recently, and then it asked me like what kind of game I would love to make, and I actually brought up a licensed game, believe it or not. So the Alien franchise is one of my favorite film franchises of all time. Yes, there are some really bad movies in that franchise, but there are also some really good ones as well, and I feel like the license itself and kind of the world that was built in those games is actually a really well-built world with a lot of lore to it that can be explored outside the movies. In fact, I think the Alien comic books and novels, for example, are maybe just as strong as even some of the best movies in that franchise. So when I thought about games that would really work as RPGs, I thought of like the Alien franchise, because I feel like that's a franchise that doesn't work super well as the kind of the thing that it kind of gets pigeonholed a lot into as far as video games are concerned, like first person shooters and stuff like that, because it kind of removes a lot of the tension and the scariness from that game. Whereas I look at a game like Parasite Eve that was on the PlayStation 1, it was kind of like a survival horror turn-based RPG. And I would love to see like an Aliens franchise game that was like Parasite Eve, where it was like a mix of like a strategy, like a survival horror game and a turn-based role-playing game, and kind of fuse those together, because I feel like then you could really amp up the tension and the scariness of it, while also not making not lose that scariness within the first 2 hours of gameplay. Because I think that franchise works great in 2 different variations. It either works in like Outlast style survival horror games like Alien Isolation, or something where you kind of take the action out of it and do something more turn-based and kind of slow it down a little bit. So that's the same thing I would love to see, whether it's a turn-based game like Parasite Eve, or even like a strategy RPG. I think would be really cool for that too. Like maybe something like XCOM, but with aliens. I think would be like really
interesting.
Cool. So yeah, that's kind of my pick for this.
Well, I have a question for that. So I'm not into the Aliens versus Predator franchise at all. Like I haven't watched too many movies or anything like that. So do the aliens have like many different types of aliens, and I guess just like multiple henchmen and stuff like that? I'm just trying to imagine what the kind of game.
Absolutely. So there's actually multiple type of xenomorphs that they explore more outside the movies, like more in the comic books or whatnot, because the xenomorphs themselves, since they breed by kind of, laying eggs in kind of the chest of, whatever mammal they can attach themselves to, what usually hatches ends up being a little bit different. And it's more based on the physiology of what it kind of bred from. So, for example, in Alien 3, the alien itself is laid not in a human, but actually a cow. So the alien itself is is like on all fours and is more like an animal versus, on 2 feet when it's kind of bred from a human. So that's kind of the area that I would imagine they would go with it, where they have like a bunch of different xenomorph types from a bunch of different, animals. And I would imagine that's the direction they would go in. Plus, you've got the queen alien as well, which is huge, and it could be like one of the big bosses and stuff like that too. So, Yeah. I'd love to see something like that. Plus, there's a lot of infighting between the humans themselves in that series as well. So you'd also put that aspect into it as well, where you're fending off, the Whalen Yutani Company or something like that. So, yeah, there you go. Cool. Those are my picks. But before we go, and I go to the plugs, Garret, I almost missed a question or a comment on Discord from TPR because I forgot to put it in the doc. So we're actually going to include it here as well. TPR says, and this goes back to us talking about our favorite licensed games. I'm not one for many licensed games, but Dragon Ball surely is for me. Legacy of Goku 2 and Attack of the Saiyans jump out to me as some solid licensed titles. And Attack of the Saiyans is quite collectible on Nintendo DS nowadays, if memory serves me right, and you are correct on that, TPR, it is a little bit collectible. Ryan and Garrick, do either of you have fond memories of these games or any other Dragon Ball RPGs? So we talked about that a little bit. I know, Garret, you haven't really played any of the Dragon Ball RPGs.
Not really, no.
Whereas I played Legacy of Goku. So on Game Boy Advance, there were 2 action RPGs based on the Dragon Ball franchise. There was Legacy of Goku 1 and 2, where the first one was up until the end of the Frieza saga, and then the second one was from the Frieza saga until the end of the series, essentially. And they were fun action RPGs. I didn't love them as much as Attack of the Saiyans, which I think is just a much better game. But I do think they're fun. But I wouldn't put them in my list of top anime role playing games. But if you like action RPGs and you like Dragon Ball, I think they're definitely worth a look. But I don't really have too many fond memories of playing those ones in particular. It's mostly Attack of the Saiyans, where I thought that game was really, really well done. So I wish they would. Monolith Soft maybe would have done more of them, but as we talked about on the Monolith Soft episode, they have a whole bunch of other things going on at the time. So
yes,
there you go. But anyways, that's it for the show. Before we go, Garret, plugs go.
You can follow me on Twitter at Blaine Explosion, and you can find me on the Nintendo Shack, part of the Play Some Video Games Podcast Network. We are live. Well, actually, this week, it's going to be live right out now. We're going to be live Friday night because that's the day after the Game Awards, 8:30 at twitch.tv/PSVG, and you can support them at patreon.com/PSVG.
Very nice, my friend. As for me, you can find me on Twitter at Ryan Turford. You can find us on Twitter at Yumi Caprice, and on YouTube, youtube.com/Yumi Capri, and on podcast services around the globe. Quick heads up as well. Next week was actually going to be our final show before the holidays. So please be excited about that. The topic is yet to come, but I think it's actually going to be a really good topic. Well, no, I mean, we'll spoil it. It's going to be our best RPGs of the year. So start thinking now about your favorite RPGs, folks, because we will be asking for your opinions on them in the coming days. So make sure to check us out on Twitter as well. So for Garret Bland, I'm Ryan Turford. This has been the 29th level of the RPG Cave, and we're out.
Bye-bye.
The RPG Cave's mana is fueled by patrons over at patreon.com/Yumi Capri. And I want to say thanks to each and every one of our Patreon supporters for all of your support throughout the years, as well as supporting our independent content. And let's start by thanking our premium producers, Dallas Ford, Lee Navarro, the fearless leader of the Phoenix Overdrive Extra Life team, and Jonathan Brown. You can find his content over at youtube.com/PM Entertainment. Our platinum producers, Robbie Bobby Mailer and Trucker Sloth. And our gold members, Argo, Brendan Myers, Dallas Robbins, Emily O'Kelly, Heather Boney, James Johnson, Joel Brooks, Jose Jimenez, Mac Time, Benji Kong, Marcus O'Neill, RJ Kern, Dano, Skinny Matt, Mr. and Mrs. Nasty Boots, Foolish Fuji, and Xavier Reyes. Thank you all for all of your support.